Mic test. Hopefully everyone can hear me. You know what? We'll know that people can't hear me if they start saying something in the chat. So I'm just gonna start and assume my mic works. Okay. So I'm not sharing screen. Oh, I am sharing screen. Awesome. Okay. So this is session 2. We're gonna do like a bit of Python. It's not really Python review. Okay, it might be Python review for those of you who have learned Python outside of Schulich, but if your only source of Python was from the previous Schulich Ignite sessions, so the beginner ones, and this will be new to you. Basically, we're going to quickly cover objects and classes, and then we're going to do more Pygame stuff. So last session we did like a little rectangle moving around, so we're going to try and add some more stuff to that. But quick, here's like the review for it's either review or something new, depending on which one you were in. But we're going to talk about objects, right? So objects, um, literally everything in Python is actually an object. But it's basically like you can think of, I'm going to call an object like a tool with certain properties. So for example, um, okay, I'll use the analogy here, but I will also come up with a different one. But one way to think of it is, I'm going to call it, they're boxes and okay, personally, I'm not a huge fan of this analogy, but you can think of it as boxes. So you have like, um, let's say you have a snake object, right? Then it keeps track of like the attributes. So you have your object and then you can kind of store like attributes. So that's why you could think of it as a box. But think of like, yeah, for example, you have a snake and you have variables that keep track of like the length of the snake's name, its damage, if it was an in-game creature, or stuff like that. Um, so one example that we came across earlier was Pygame's rectangle object. So once again, here we're saying within the Pygame library, I want to create a rectangle object. Just use like rect in these two little brackets here, which we'll talk about more later. But this basically says, oh, I'm creating like an object of this type. And you're saying, okay, I'm gonna reference this object with rect1. So we're like calling it rect1. So if you want to access the attributes of the object, you can use the dot operator to do that. And once again, obviously you can create like different rectangles and they're like each individual, they're all rectangles, but so they belong to the same class, right? They're all belong to the rectangle class, but they have different properties. I guess like what I wanted to touch on was that most things in Python are actually objects. So if you think like a list, a tuple, um, what else? A dictionary, they're all like they all have they're all defined in a certain way. Like a list, for example, you can like add things to the list, you can remove things from the list, you can clear them. Then strings, right? You can actually add strings together, right? So it's like attributes. You have like your integers, like everything's actually I don't think in certain integers aren't an object. I'm pretty confident on that. That's like, but most things like anything in Python that you can call a dot operator on. So it's like if you made something called, my list equals at two, you can call things like my list dot append something. And that's because this thing here is actually an object. So that's like there's a lot of built-in objects, and then you can also create your own using classes, right? Okay, so here's like more examples. You can have your student object and you use the dot operator to get the properties. And then, okay. Okay, we can do like 5 minutes for this exercise. But basically you have a leaf class where in this leaves.py folder, let's have to screen share. Oh, why is Zoom? Okay. And it's like, let me share this so I can show you all. Actually, you know what? I'm going to move the exercise later. I will move the exercise down. Screw it. Now, okay, you know what? We're doing the exercise later, guys. Ignore that. So now we're like, okay, well, you're like, oh, what's a class? Like I've either heard of this or like I just mentioned it, right? So classes are like the blueprint for the object. So it's like, what does an object have to have? So for a snake, you want your name, your color, and your species. And well, you can add infinite attributes. Um, and then WinML an object. In Python, you would actually call it the instance. So you're creating your blueprint is like your class, and every time you create like an instance of the, you're calling it, it's called an instance. For every time you create an object from the class, you call it an instance of that class. Like, oh, I've created snake 1, snake 2, and snake 3. They're all separate instances, okay? Um, so there's like some syntax. Basically, you say, use the class keyword, you type the name of the class, blah, blah, blah. You can look back at this later. And then one thing that you always have, you usually have in a class is you have your inits function. And this thing over here is basically what you want the, this is what you want each to happen to each instance of the class when it's created, right? So, more slides. So in this example here, if we have like a dog class, then whenever you create a dog, you might want to set like the number of licks and the sound that it makes to some default value. And the way you do that is, so every, no, I think there's a keyword here. Yes. Right, okay, fine. So basically anything that you have like self in front of, self dot whatever, that's referring to the instance itself, right? So kind of like a side note here, by default, you always, init always takes like the self keyword, which is, it's like a reference to the object itself. So if I create something called like snake1 self or whatever the first, so it doesn't have to be called self, it's more of a convention, but if I call this like A, for example, and I turn all these into A, oops. Anyway, you get the points. Whenever I create like a snake, snake1, the self keyword is referencing the snake itself. So it could be like, if I want to access snake1 dot number of licks, then I would, since I'm accessing it from the from within the function, right? I would actually have to use the self keyword instead. Otherwise, you're like, yeah. So if you don't use the self keyword, then I believe you're accessing the class variable, which is shared across the class, but we usually don't use those. So if you end up wanting to use that, you can look up like class variables and how to use them. So if I like took away this, I don't know. Like you're no longer assigning this name variable to the object that you just created. You're just assigning it to the entire class, so it's like shared. So that's why you always want to make sure you're like, if you want to assign the attributes of the object that you're just creating, you always want to use the self keyword. And like I said, by default, this is always the first argument to every method within a class. So like methods, basically that's the name for a function within the class. So every function within a class is called a method. Yeah, so here's more slides. You can really come back to it, but in a way you can think of it as a placeholder for the word like my. That's like another way to look at it. And that brings us to our first quick question. And that is, what is wrong with this code? Should be pretty obvious. They may not have mentioned it directly, but I'll send you the slides as well, and you can kind of figure it out. By the way, you're supposed to answer through top hat, so it'll be multiple choice. And if you're unsure, like I said, I sent the slides in the chat, so you can quickly go through like the last few slides, because I don't think I mentioned it directly, but just kind of think it through. Notice the pattern. Anyways. Oh, sharing the window? Okay. Jen, did you open the top hat yet?
Yes, I have. 8 people have answered out of 15.
Mm. Huh. Oops. I can do like a really quick breakout room for you guys to. Well, we'll do the next exercise, but those of you who can't get top hat working, fix that first.
Because, yeah, there's only 13 people in the top hat, and there's 15.
Out of
Yeah.
15.
Yeah.
Deanna, did you get it to work? If it's still not, well, whoops. I guess I should be showing the question.
Should I just finish it, Ryan? Or,
Yeah. What are the results?
oh, share. You want me to share my screen?
Yeah. I guess I can just tell them the answer, but I like to look. Okay, cool. Everyone got it right. Yes. Yeah. So in this case, if you use eye color as the first variable, then if you want to reference eye color, you should be using eye color dot eye color. Anyways, yeah. So we're gonna have like a quick exercise where you get to use a class. It's already been made. Oh, I'm not screen sharing. Yes, but anyway, you're gonna get to use a class. I'm gonna do like I feel like 10 minutes for this one because it's meant to be like a pretty quick breakout room. Um, for those of you who are like already familiar with classes, I would say, hmm, hmm, come up with your own thing. I'm not too sure. Yeah, if you're like, oh, this is easy, and you get it done in like 2 seconds or something, just add more steps to the class. Be fancy, like maybe make the class draw the entire tree, because right now it just literally draws like a rectangle, but maybe you want to add the trunk as a default. Also, like consider, you guys can see the screen, right? Consider adding like, consider so that when you create an instance of the leaves class, it draws a rectangle as well instead of just like, or has like a self dot rectangle, right? Because right now we just have, and even if you're like, honestly, this might be the better way to go about it, but so the simplest way, okay, if you are like not familiar with classes, then you just use like you have this leaves class and you take the X and the Y and the sides and stuff, and you're gonna pass it into like a pygame.rect. But I'd argue the more efficient way to do this, if you know what you're doing, I would say try and add like a self.rect into your leaves, and then you can pass that self.rect object, which it should be a pygame rectangle object, by the way. Um, so then you could pass that directly into the draw function. Anyways. Uh, all right. Okay. Once again, the slides are in the chat. Hmm. Yeah. If you weren't able to finish, you can get back to it later, but hopefully it's like good practice. Okay. Mm. So now we're gonna like kind of go back over how to build a class because I kind of skimmed over that last time. I'll go through this like kind of quickly as well because you have a chance to actually practice during the end of session. But basically, you want to use the class keyword. You name the class. You put a colon. Anyways, you can see it. Basically, one of the things you want to do when naming class is every new letter you want to use like a capital. Sorry, not a letter. Every new word you want to capitalize the first letter. It's called Pascal case. And then you always want to have an initial. Okay, the initiation function is not mandatory, but usually you want to have if you want the class, if you want to set like default values, then you want to have an initiation function. And you can actually do anything in the initiation function. So you could have it, you could like print something to the console, you could create like maybe if you had like a character object, maybe you want to arm them with like a sword when they first spawn in. So you could be like self.sword equals new sword object, something like that. And finally, if you want to create an instance of the class, you say my snake equals snake. And then next you pass in you pass in whichever arguments you want to the, basically the arguments that you're passing in when you create a new object from a class is what gets passed into the your init function. And then you can, the way you access the attributes is up here in the init function, we created like I call them attributes. I guess you can call them member variables as well, but yeah. So basically a variable that belongs to the instance of the class itself, you create them here, right? So once you set this like self.name equals something, then every snake that gets initialized afterward will have a self.name attributes. So now the question is, what's the correct outputs? Oops. So I'm gonna let me just share it. All right. Now let's not play it.
There's only 11 people that are answering, so this is last call. Last 30 seconds to answer.
Slides. Oh, yes. Um, yeah, so we step through it step by step. What happens is we define the class up here, and then you create a person here. And when we create an instance of the person, you go and you say, okay, what's in the init function? And you go, okay, so we set the self.name attribute to George. And so now you've created this, you can, I guess I would call it an instance variable. The terminology is not that relevant, but yeah, so you set the instance variable in this line, and now you can, now that's a variable, it's being assigned to something, you can print it, and it prints to the terminal. If anyone was still confused, if they're like, huh, but I think I should throw an error, you can honestly just throw something in the chat right now, because then you can just have your confusion be resolved earlier. But if it's like, oh no, that makes sense, then don't worry about it. Yeah, also, like I mentioned before, you can have objects within objects. So like when I'm doing a init, I could be like self dot error equals, wait, that's error objects. Anyways, you could have an object within an object, and maybe like more practically in Pygame, what you'll see a lot of is stuff.rect equals pygame.rect. And I think you're supposed to pass in like some parameters. You have your x, you have x, y, width. So this is like a pretty common thing you'll see, like the rectangle. You also have in Pygame, you have stuff.image, which usually it's like, I don't remember the exact. Basically, it's a file. You're like, okay, let me use Pygame's image loading function to load a file from my computer and load that in. So that's like, those are like common examples of where you might have an object in an object. And here's an analogy with your Mars rovers where you have, what is this? You have your spaceship and you have your rover within the spaceship, and then you have like camera within the rover, something like that. Anyways. Right, so like example, as said before, and if you wanted to access the rectangle within the snake, then you go mysnake.rect. And then if you want to access the rectangle, the X position of the rectangle within the snake, then you use the dot of the rectangle. And you can see how that goes. Now we're gonna cover like imports. Pygame itself is a library, right? So actually earlier when we used this leaf thing, if you saw at the beginning of this file, you'll see that we actually import, we don't import the whole class, but we're using the use of the import function, right? But really all it does is you're like, okay, if I have some code in, wait, wrong slide, okay. Yeah, if you have some code in one file, then you can get code out of it and put it, you can use code in like, let's say we have our main file and we have like a utilities file, and you can import code from your utilities file into your main file and you can make use of it. And it's really just a way of keeping your stuff organized. Um, so one rule of thumb is like you want to use different files for, I wouldn't really say classes. Okay, you kind of get used to this as you code. You realize like, oh, it's good to have these things together. But I guess you can start by just putting each class in its own file. But eventually it will be things more like everything to do with like the menu screen goes into one file, or like maybe all of your constants might go into one file. And everyone has like their own way of organizing it. So what's most important is that you document it well. Like you just add comments and you're like, this file holds like this, especially at the top of the comment, you want to like create some comments and you'd be like, okay, this is what the stuff in this file does, right? And the key is really like, if you have stuff in the same file, they should probably be doing the same thing. And that just makes it so when you open the main file, you don't have like, 1,000 lines of code that someone has to look through and be like, what class does what? And the way that you access functions within classes or functions within another file is you use the dot operator, kind of like we do with classes themselves. So this is kind of what you're doing when you import Pygame. Pygame, you can think of Pygame a little like it's like a huge file with a bunch of functions that make it easier to code games. And then every time you use the dot operator, you're like, okay, let me access like a specific part of Pygame. And then within that part, we're accessing like another sub piece of it that, whatever. Okay, maybe you can think of it like a class, but then another class within the class. So you might be like within Pygame, I think this is a function. I might be wrong, but you know what? Whatever. Better example, Pygame.rect, right? So this is just your rectangle class. You're accessing the rectangle class within the Pygame file. If you did this, for example, then you're probably accessing. You have Pygame, you have your image class, and it might not actually be written exact. I think it is written this way actually. You have your image class within Pygame. Don't know why it's not uppercase, so it might not be a class. But anyways, don't worry about the details, not really relevant. But then you're like, within this class, let me access the load function, right? Something like that. Okay. You always write your imports at the top so that people know what you're importing. And once again, you also have like built-in files or imports if you want to call them. But yeah, built-in files with functionality that you can import as well, including Pygame. And the last thing you can do is you can, instead of importing the whole class and like having to use like math dot, word or something, you can import functions directly, so you don't have to use like the prefix at the beginning. So if you import sine specifically, then you can use sine x. Yeah. Yeah, like we said, you can use a class or a function. And then finally, we're just gonna go through like an exercise. We're not, sorry, not go through. So then just end of session. Um, so this is like a lot like what we did last time, but the difference is that you want to use a class and you want to create like multiple instances of the class. And my challenge to you would be to use a for loop to draw all of them, but still with like the randomness. But to start with, you can make like, a couple platforms and just make like initialize them manually. So you'd be like platform one equals, XY width height, and then platform two equals blah, blah, blah. But in the end, what you want to be able to do is you want to like initialize them all with a for loop. And yeah, you also have some bonuses. You want to make them move to the left. You also, in your second bonus, is like a couple. And but actually, I guess the putting them in a loop is also kind of a bonus, but it's really something you want to be able to do if you're going to make a game. Like you do not want to be initializing your platforms by hands. Yeah, so that's that. And yeah, by the way, the links work. You can submit your code and you can view the leaderboard here. So as usual, if you have questions, feel free to ask. If you have questions about university, also feel free to ask because your mentors are all in university. So yeah, cool.